Welcome, seekers of the hidden and the profound. Today, the question on the table is, what is Protestantism? According to Redeemed Zoomer, it's simple, just the 7 churches that came out of the Reformation. But is that definition deep enough? Or does it miss those core fundamentals of what it means to be Protestant? In this video, the first episode in a 3-part series, we're going to unpack Redeemed Zoomer's claim, break down its logic, expose its flaws, and offer something better. My definition. Using tools like set theory and conceptual analysis, we'll explore what Protestantism truly is. My claim is that it's made up of 6 core characteristics, and today we'll tackle the first 2, after we've taken care of Redeemed Zoomer's view on it. So, as always, grab your favorite drink, settle into your chair, and let's begin. We can start by asking what exactly is the Redeemed Zoomer position, and what's his argument for it. In short, he argues that Protestantism should be defined extensionally. That means instead of giving an abstract list of properties or characteristics, you understand what Protestantism is by listing examples of Protestant churches.
So, to the Catholics watching this, I'm not asking that you all become mainline Protestant. That'd be nice, but I'm not asking that. I think you're fine in the Catholic Church. I want you all to understand what Protestantism is. Protestantism is the 7 churches that came from the Reformation, and debatably, their offshoots as well.
And what are those 7 churches?
Presbyterian, Lutheran, Methodist, Episcopal, Reformed, Baptist, and Congregationalist.
He also clarifies his definition by saying,
I define Protestantism the same way you would define Catholicism or Orthodoxy. It's an institution. A Protestant is someone who's part of a Protestant church, and a Protestant church is a church with roots in the Reformation.
We can make Redeemed Zoomer's extensional definition a bit more precise using set theory. Think of it like this. Protestantism equals P, L, M, E, R, B, and C. Here, Protestantism is a set made of 7 subsets, P for Presbyterian, L for Lutheran, M for Methodist, E for Episcopal, R for Reformed, B for Baptist, and C for Congregationalist. Each of these subsets includes specific churches that can be traced back to the Reformation through an institutional lineage. In other words, if a church has historical roots in one of these traditions, it counts as constituting Protestantism under this definition. Now, when it comes to defining Protestant as a person, Redeemed Zoomer switches from an extensional approach to an intentional one. And that means, instead of just listing churches, he gives a condition that must be met for someone to count as a Protestant. This, in plain English, means a person X is a Protestant if there exists some Y in the set of Protestant churches, such as that X stands in the relation R, meaning church membership, to Y. Or in regular English, Protestant equals for every X, X is a member of one of the churches in P, L, M, E, R, B, or C. Now, what can we say about this definition? Well, for starters, it's intelligible. If we can model it using mathematical tools like set theory and relational logic, that's already a good sign. But that doesn't mean it's problem-free. There are some semantic and pragmatic issues we'll need to dig into. Here's the first issue. Let's call it the uninformativeness objection. By pointing to just these 7 churches, Redeemed Zoomer doesn't actually tell us much. Sure, we can get the names, Presbyterian, Lutheran, Methodist, and so on, and we're told that they all came out of the Protestant Reformation. But what does that really tell us about Protestantism or Protestants? What was the Reformation actually about? Why do these churches have different names in the first place? Do those names reflect different beliefs? And if they're so different, why group them all under one label? The problem is this extensional definition, and by consequence the intentional one based on it, gives us almost no meaningful information about Protestantism as really is. It's like labeling a bunch of things without explaining what they have in common. Secondly, this definition creates some counterintuitive results. Let's call this one the unintuitiveness objection. Trent Warren noticed this problem too when he said,
I think where it gets difficult though is like when I say evangelical, like help me run through this. It seems like evangelicals just have a lot more doctrinal, in spite of them having less institution, they seem to have more doctrinal unity than the mainline churches. Like if because you're trying to fix all of like this liberalness within the main lines, there's not as much of that in evangelicalism.
The issue here is that conservative groups like evangelicals that split from mainline Protestant churches often seem more faithful to core Reformation principles. Yet, according to Redeemed Zoomer's definition, they wouldn't qualify as Protestants, simply because their voluntary separation caused them to lose direct institutional membership with historical Protestant churches. In other words, RZ's definition paradoxically excludes some groups that might actually align more closely with original Protestant ideas than the churches they're leaving behind. So to recapitulate, RZ's definition is ambiguous. It leaves far too much open to interpretation, relying on what each person understands about these 7 churches and their historical context. And even worse, it creates confusion when we try to apply it practically, especially when dealing with groups that may hold views closer to the original ideas of the Reformation, yet are excluded by his definition. Because of these issues, this definition simply doesn't hold up as a useful or reliable standard for rational conversation. So, what's a better approach? Well, if we could solve these 2 problems, uninformativeness and unintuitiveness, we'd get a far stronger definition. And brothers, that's exactly what I'm going to share with you right now. Alright, before I give you the actual definition, let me quickly explain the method behind it. The approach I'm using is called conceptual analysis. Here's how it works. You start with a short definition that uses broad or loaded terms, words that carry a lot of meaning packed into them. Then, step by step, you unpack those terms into simpler, clear components that people can understand and apply. Think of it like this. We have a loaded definition, A and B and C, and then we unpack that through analysis. A equals A1, A2, A3, and B equals B1, B2, and so forth. So when we fully unpack it, the definition ends up looking like this. The goal here is clarity. We're trying to replace ambiguous concepts with definite, understandable ones. With that explained, let's get into it. Protestantism can be defined in 2 ways, and these 2 approaches aren't mutually exclusive. In fact, they complement each other. The first is a theoretical definition. This treats Protestantism as a specific religious framework within Christianity, of course. It's based on a set of conditions that are individually necessary and jointly sufficient, and that means if someone or a church, a theology, a community fails to meet any of these conditions, they simply don't qualify as Protestant under this definition. The second definition is historical. It's chronological. This one doesn't define Protestantism by a list of properties, but by tracing a sequence of real-world events, peoples, places, and movements that mark its emergence in history. So, in short, one definition tells us what Protestantism is, and the other tells us how it came to be. Of these 2 definitions, the historical or chronological one takes precedence over the theoretical one. Why? Because every piece of data we use to build a theoretical definition of Protestantism ultimately comes from real life, from the actual events, people, and places that shaped its ideas. With that said, for the sake of explanation, which is what we're doing here, it's more didactic to start with the theoretical definition. Once we've laid that foundation, we can then trace how those core ideas gradually emerge throughout history. In other words, we'll start with what Protestantism means, and then, in some future videos, we'll look at how it came to exist. So then, how do we define theoretical Protestantism? To maintain the suspense of this trilogy of videos, it suffices to say that it consists of 6 core attributes. As I mentioned earlier, today we're going to look at 2 of them, and those are religion and the Apostles' Creed. Now, let's take a closer look at each one. One helpful way to understand what religion means comes from Philip Schaff in his 1893 work, Theological Propedeutic. There, he gives a broad but useful definition. Religion is the relationship between humanity and God. Schaff points out that we can understand this relationship from 2 main angles, the subjective and the objective. The subjective side refers to a person's individual faith and piety. That is, how someone personally experiences and expresses their devotion to God. The objective side deals with the external or visible expressions of that devotion, things like rituals, public worship, and organized religion practices within a community. So religion in this context isn't just about personal belief. It also includes the shared practices that give form to that belief. Now, I think Schaff's definition gives us a solid starting point, but let's take it a step further. To that end, let's bring in George Trumbull Ladd and his 1909 book, The Philosophy of Religion, Volume 1. Ladd takes a more nuanced view. For him, religion is a deeply human phenomenon. It involves your whole being, your mind, your emotions, and your will. And it shows up in different forms, from the most primitive beliefs in unseen powers to more refined ideas like a perfect moral spirit. In other words, religion is universal, but it's also a specific way humans try to make sense of ultimate reality. And because of that, all religions end up making some kind of metaphysical claim about the nature of the world. Here's how Ladd himself puts it, and pay attention to how packed this is.
Taken at its lowest terms and considered as universal with man, religion is the belief in invisible superhuman powers, or a power, which are conceived of after the analogy of the human spirit, on which man regards himself as dependent for his well-being, and which he is, at least in some sense, responsible for his conduct, together with the feelings and practices which naturally follow from such a belief.
So religion isn't just belief. It's a whole life response to something greater than ourselves. Ladd also outlines how religion appears in its most primitive forms, things like shamanism, fetishism, totemism, and even theology, which is the worship of wild animals. But as religion develops, it takes on a more ethical and personal character. For Ladd, the natural evolution of religion moves from a belief in many separate spiritual forces, each with its own function, toward a unified understanding of a single personal being, one who has a purpose and the moral law for humanity. And here's how he puts it in his own words.
Religion, when conceived of in conformity to its own ideals, is the belief in the being of the world as perfect ethical spirit, with the entire emotional and practical life brought into harmony with this belief.
So let's break that down into 4 main takeaways. So religion starts as a universal belief in the invisible, in superhuman powers, imagined in the likeness of the human spirit. And these beliefs are accompanied by a sense of dependence, moral responsibility, and practices that express that relationship. Then, as humanity grows, so does religion. It gradually shifts from many spirits to belief in one perfect ethical spirit. This shift reflects a deepening in the truth, purity, and moral direction of our spiritual understanding. Ladd also stresses that religion isn't just about belief, it's about the entire person, your intellect, your emotions, and your will. If a definition of religion ignores any of those, it's incomplete. Finally, religion isn't just personal, it's cosmic. It offers a view of ultimate reality, a way of understanding the universe itself and where we fit into the grand scheme of things. So, pulling together what we've seen from Schaff and Ladd, we can start to form a solid picture of what religion is. At its core, religion is a universal human phenomenon. It shows up across all cultures in forms that range from simple and primitive to deeply complex and refined. And as it evolves, it tends to follow a natural trajectory, from belief in many spiritual powers to a unified belief in one personal moral being. But it's not just an abstract idea. Religion taps into every part of our subjective experience, our thoughts, our feelings, our will, and it doesn't stay private. Those inner experiences lead to outer expressions, like rituals, symbols, shared practices, and community worship. And at the heart of it all is relationship. Not just belief in some distant force, but in personal entities who have intentions, emotions, and moral expectations. Religion then is about seeking communion with these beings. That's why we pray, why we gather, why we perform rituals. Those outward expressions are how we act out the deeper reality of that relationship. So now we can ask the next big question. What makes this whole experience of communion with the transcendent specifically Christian? In other words, what turns religion into Christian religion? The answer is rooted in the first formal profession of faith created by the early church, what we now call the Apostles' Creed. According to Charles Augustus Briggs in his 1913 book, The Fundamental Christian Faith,
the Apostles' Creed may be traced to the middle of the 2nd century by distinct references to it in Irenaeus and Tertullian.
So we're talking about a creed with roots that go nearly 1800 years back. Philip Schaff agrees with that dating, pointing again to Irenaeus and Tertullian. But he also adds a qualifier. The first full Latin version, complete with commentary, doesn't show up until the late 4th century through a writer named Rufinus. From Schaff's The Creeds of Christendom, we read,
The first Heiter in the first who keeps us the text of the Latin Creed with a commentary is Rufinus towards the close of the 4th century.
But Briggs doesn't miss this detail either.
The earliest form of the Roman Creed that has been preserved is from the middle of the 4th century. Rufinus, a priest of Aquileia, wrote a commentary on the Apostles' Creed in the last quarter of the 4th century.
So, why was this creed written in the first place? What was its purpose? The Apostles' Creed was developed out of necessity. Early Christians needed a clear, concise, and easily memorizable summary of the faith, especially for catechumens, those preparing for baptism. As Briggs put it,
it is evident from the statements of the New Testament that a confession or profession of faith was necessary in order to baptism.
So a short, standardized guide that summed up the teachings of the apostles. First passed down orally and eventually written, it helped ensure that Christians across different regions held to the same essential beliefs. Briggs also notes,
the primitive usage to baptism required a special preparation, which consisted in committing to memory the Christian creed and receiving instruction upon its articles.
In other words, before someone could join the church, they had to understand what Christianity actually taught. And Schaff adds a key insight.
The Apostles' Creed is not a word of God to men, but a word of man to God, in response to his revelation. It was originally and essentially a baptismal confession, growing out of the inner life and the practical needs of early Christianity.
So the creed wasn't handed down from heaven like stone tablets. It was crafted by the early church as a faithful human response, an attempt to clearly express what Christians believe in unity and simplicity. Over time, the Christian leadership saw the need to standardize this profession of faith, and the reason was clear. Heresies were spreading. These false teachings were threatening the core of Christian doctrine, and something had to be done to preserve the faith's integrity. That's where the Apostles' Creed came in. By locking down a clear and consistent summary of what Christians believe, the early church could protect orthodoxy and ensure that the apostolic faith was faithfully passed down. As Briggs put it,
these early Christians did not think that they were making any new doctrines. They sincerely believed and were firmly assured that they were simply expressing the essential teachings of Jesus Christ and of his apostles.
This standardization was crucial. It meant that no matter where you lived or how different your culture might be, all Christians could stand on the same foundational truths. So, to sum it all up, the Apostles' Creed was created to provide a clear, unified expression of Christian belief. It served as a tool for teaching, unity, and defense against false doctrine. And the early church's efforts to standardize it helped ensure that Christianity's foundations would be preserved, protected, and passed down through the centuries. And the Apostles' Creed was just the beginning. As theological challenges grew more complex, the early church responded with creeds that went deeper, especially in their metaphysical complexity. First came the Nicene Creed, drafted at the Council of Nicaea in 325. Then the Chalcedonian Creed followed in 451, adding precision to how Christians understand the union of Christ's divine and human natures. The Nicene-Constantinopolitan Creed, which expanded on the original Nicene Creed, was written at the Council of Constantinople in 481, bringing even more metaphysical hair-splitting to the doctrine of the Trinity. And finally, there's the Athanasian Creed. Its origins are a bit murky. It likely came from Gaul, modern-day France, or North Africa around the 8th or 9th century. Because we can't definitively link it to Athanasius himself, it's often called the Pseudo-Athanasian Creed. Together, these creeds are known as the Ecumenical Creeds. Why? Because to be considered authentically Christian across denominations and traditions, a person must affirm at least one of these creeds. But what makes these creeds ecumenic? According to Philip Schaff and Charles Briggs, it's because these creeds contain the core teachings of the apostles, the foundational doctrines that have been universally recognized by the Church across time, geography, and tradition. As Schaff explains in the Creeds of Christendom, Volume 1,
by ecumenical or general symbols, symbola ecumenica, symbola catholica, we understand the doctrinal confessions of ancient Christianity, which are to this day either formally or tacitly acknowledged in the Greek, the Latin, and evangelical Protestant churches, and form a bond of union between them.
Charles Briggs echoes this understanding. He emphasizes not only their doctrinal authority, but also their historical significance.
These three creeds, Apostles, Nicene, Pseudo-Athanasian, as officially interpreted by ancient ecumenical councils, constitute the fundamental Christian faith. They express officially the faith of the Church in that stage of the development of its definitions, which had been reached at the time they were composed. They cover the 7 fundamental centuries of the Christian Church, during which the Church suffered its severest trials and gained its greatest victories. These centuries constituted the heroic age of Christianity, the age of the fathers of the Church, and therefore the faith of that age, as expressed in its official creeds, must always command more respect and authority than the faith of any other centuries.
So, why are these specific creeds, the Apostles, the Nicene, and the Athanasian, considered apostolic and ecumenical or Catholic, while others aren't? It comes down to 4 key reasons. The first one is their historical origin and apostolic authority. So while the Apostles' Creed was literally written by the Apostles, it's still considered apostolic because it faithfully reflects the core teachings they handed down. As Charles Briggs puts it,
many attempts have been made to distribute the 12 articles of the Creed amongst the apostles, but they are all artificial and they betray unoriginality by their lack of correspondence with the historical origin and proper distribution of the various clauses. The traditional belief that these articles express the faith of the apostles is sufficient to account for the assignment of the articles to them. This assignment of the Creed to the apostles corresponds with similar assignments of the Didache, or teaching of the apostles, the didascalia, the constitution of the apostles, etc. There is behind the legend the fact that Tertullian and Irenaeus regard the creed as apostolic in statement of faith.
In general, these creeds emerged in the first centuries of Christianity when the early church was still close to the apostolic witness, and their content reflects that legacy. The second reason is their universal and ecumenical acceptance. These creeds weren't just used in one region or one tradition. They became accepted across the entire Christian world. Schaff highlights this point.
They are three in number: the Apostles' Nicene and the Athanasian Creed. The first is the simplest. The other two are fuller developments and interpretations of the same. The Apostles' Creed is the most popular in the Western, the Nicene in the Eastern churches. To them may be added the Christological statement of the Ecumenical Council of Chalcedon in 451. It has a more undisputed authority than the Athanasian Creed, to which the term ecumenical applies only in a qualified sense. But as it is seldom used, it is generally omitted from the collections. These three of four creeds contain in brief popular outline the fundamental articles of the Christian faith as necessary and sufficient for salvation.
So, whether you were in the Eastern Orthodox Church, the Roman Catholic Church, or later among the Protestant reformers, these creeds formed common ground. The third reason is their doctrinal and theological foundation. These creeds don't just state vague spiritual ideas. They lay out the essential tenets of Christian doctrine. Schaff again says,
They embody the results of the great doctrinal controversies of the Nicene and post-Nicene ages.
Think of debates about the Trinity, the divine and human natures of Christ, or the relationship between the Father, Son, and Holy Spirit. These creeds resolved those debates and set a theological standard for orthodoxy. The fourth reason is their liturgical and catechetical use. So these creeds weren't just theoretical. They were woven into the worship and instruction of the Church. Briggs notes,
These creeds are essentially Christological in character. They express the personal convictions and religious experience of Christians in their relation to Jesus Christ, their Savior. They express what these Christians regarded as the essentials of their Christian experience, that which they must hold as their faith in life and death for their salvation. This is stated in bold and rigid forms in the Athanasian Creed, but it is implied in other creeds. For no one could be baptized and partake of the Christian sacrament without the public expression of faith in terms of these creeds. The Nicene Creed, as issued from the Nicene Council, had attached to it an anathema on all who pretended to be Christians and yet did not have this faith.
So from baptismal vows to public worship to catechism classes, these creeds became central tools for forming and uniting the faithful. So, summing all this, why are these creeds considered apostolic and ecumenical? Because they reflect the faith of the apostles, even if not directly authored by them. They've been universally accepted across major Christian traditions. They define the core doctrines of Christianity clearly and concisely. And they've played a central role in both worship and spiritual formation throughout history. So, according to both Schaff and Briggs, it's the combination of four key factors: historical origin, universal acceptance, doctrinal clarity, and continued use. These explain why these creeds, and not others, are recognized as truly apostolic. And, in my view, the most important of them all is the Apostles' Creed. Why? Because it's the original, the foundation. It captures the essence of Christianity in its purest form, before all the metaphysical layers were added in response to theological controversies and disputes with other groups. It's simple, it's clear, and it speaks directly to the heart of the faith. If you want to know what Christianity is, start here. So that's all for today, friends of divine knowledge, and stay vigilant, for when the bell tolls, I will return with the filioque and justification by faith. Till then, don't forget to pray before bed. You never know what lurks in the dark.